In theory, this should be working. Hi, you guys. Welcome. Hooray. This presentation is about managing documentation projects in nearly any environment. So obviously, hopefully, you have figured out that I'm Sharon Burton. I don't have my webcam on because I have on no makeup, and I have not brushed my hair for a bit. So, but that's what I look like when I have a little makeup on and I have brushed my hair. A lot of you guys probably know me, but I want to just introduce myself anyway if you don't. I've been in the TechComm business for a long time, for 20 years, which I find to be kind of amazing because I didn't start out to do this as a career. This was something that I was doing in college because it paid fairly well as I was finishing up graduate school. And then it turns out that this is so darned exciting that this is what I've wound up doing. So I'm always kind of amazed that I'm not only still here, but I'm still here enthusiastically. I happen to think that what we do as TechComm professionals is one of the most important things that we can do. What we are doing is we're providing instructions so human beings can go do those amazing things that human beings do. And I personally find that just endlessly exciting. Yesterday I was talking at my local university. They were having career day, and they asked me to come talk because I'm a social science major who did good, and it's my school. So they asked me to come talk to other social science humanities students to talk about what it is I do as a thing that one could do coming out of the humanities. And as I was explaining what it was I do, I discovered I got chills all over again. I really did. I got chills. Because I really think that what we do is just that darned exciting. So, and they give us money to do it, which is just the best. So what I actually do is I solve business content social media problems. That's what I do. I'm a consultant because that's the fun part. I also teach communication at various universities. I teach, most interestingly, I teach technical communication to engineering students at the University of California, Riverside. So should you be working with an engineer, a younger engineer, who understands the importance of clear communication, feel free to send me a thank you note. I will pass it on to my co-teacher, and it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. You may know I have a new book out, 8 Steps to Amazing Webinars. That's my little thing. It's available from Amazon and Barnes & Noble as an ebook or as a hard copy, and it's pretty exciting. I'm also working on the next book, which is not webinars. Because I don't have enough to do. So that's kind of me. I don't guess there's any questions about who I am because I'm not that interesting really. So let's get to the presentation. So as I was thinking about this topic, how do you manage product documentation in any kind of environment? I was thinking, okay, we've got to kind of define some of the concepts I want to talk about, and I found that to be kind of funny because if I had given this presentation even as recently as within the last 3 to 5 years, I don't think I would have needed to do these definitions. But it's all changing, and it's changing really quickly. It's changing as we're sitting here. So I want to make sure that we all understand what it is that we're talking about because it is changing so quickly. I think it's exciting, but it's changing really quickly. User content. It used to be, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, we wrote manuals. Some of you may remember that, or it could be I'm the oldest person in the room, but I doubt that. I bet we all remember, at least most of us remember, when our job was to just create manuals. And if customers wanted to find out how our products were used, how to use our products, by and large, they consulted the documentation that we created. We were the one voice, the source of all truth, all knowledge, all of that. That is not the case anymore. There is user content now, which is multiple things. It is in the big picture, user content is content that is created to face our customers. It is the content that our customers will be in. Now, the part that's really changed is that may be the content that our team, your team, or the company is creating. Certainly, some of that user content is coming from your team or your department or your company. But not all of it anymore. Not all of it anymore. Now, because of social media and many other interesting things, our customers are creating a heck of a lot of content as well. So they're creating content on Twitter, on Facebook, on Foursquare, on Pinterest, on all of these different social media sites. They're creating content. There are user forums. Now, there have been some user forums, we call them news groups, for a long, long time. You know, I've been in the business for 20 years. There were news groups even before I was in the business. But there are new, different user groups now. There are user forums on places like LinkedIn, where people are talking about products. Very often they're talking about your products. There are blogs. There are blogs that your customers are creating, and they're talking about your products. There's wikis that your customers are creating. Just regular people are creating these things. There are the old notes passed around the office. Now, that's not necessarily new, but I think it's getting more common. It's just notes passed around the office, things that people have stuck up on their wall. There's more. There's just every way that you can think of content to be created, it's being created. And I sometimes call this content ad hoc. I don't know that we've come up with a word for it yet. Yeah, I mean, we've been trying out some big words, you know, like community-created content, and you know, I just call it ad hoc content. And if you think that content isn't particularly helpful, I'd like to tell you a small story. I have in my house a wireless router that is connected to my cable modem. And since I work from home, one of the beauties of being a consultant is I get to work from home. I need the wireless router to work all over the house. I do not have a gigantic house, but it is an old house. And because the smallest bedroom in the house is my home office, and because the smallest room in the house, which is my home office, shares a wall with the largest bathroom in the house, and it's an old house, the entire wall that is common is full of lead pipes. Now, if you know anything about wireless, you just suddenly put your face in your hands and went, oh no. Oh yes. To get this wireless signal anywhere else in my house, and the rest of the house is on the other side of that wall, I have to have repeaters. What are repeaters? They pick up the wireless signal and they repeat it on through the house. So my husband's office is 15 feet away on the other side of the wall full of lead pipes. To get the wireless signal in there reliably, I have a wireless repeater in his office. Now, what does this have to do with ad hoc content? Well, when I bought the Linksys wireless router and I bought the Linksys repeater, I followed the instructions for setting up the repeater, and they helped me not at all. So I thought, all right, I cannot be the only person who has struggled with this. I'm going on the internet. You guys have all done this too. And I found a forum where somebody posted the instructions for making this work. Were the instructions spelled correctly? No. Did they follow good documentation, information, structure practices? Not the slightest. Were they even really numbered steps? Not so much, no. Were they accurate? Yes. Yes, they were. When I did exactly what those steps said, I got my wireless router to work. So this ad hoc content, in fact, can work genius. But it is not the lovely content that we're used to dealing with. A little bit more about that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. The interesting thing about this ad hoc content, as well as the content that you're creating, is you may or may not have control over some of this content. Now, if it's user forums that your company hosts, you absolutely have some control over that. And we as TechComm people can do stuff with that. But if they're user forums that we're not hosting, for example, LinkedIn, we don't necessarily have any control over that content. If it's your wiki, you absolutely, yours and your company's wiki, you have some control over that. If it is somebody else's wiki and they've got inaccurate information on it, not a lot we can do about that. Online help that we're creating, we have a lot of control over that. If we are using one of the tools that are out there now that lets our customers make comments on our online help, which I think is just the coolest, neatest thing ever, and I just love that we can actually let our users make comments on our online help now. After spending years wondering if anybody was ever actually even reading it, now we can actually have a passive conversation with our online help. That rocks. We have a lot of control over where that content is, how it appears, et cetera, et cetera. Corporate blogs, does your company have a corporate blog? You may or may not have control of that. I have found that if that corporate blog is being done by executives, you probably have no control over it because your executives, of course, know how to write brilliantly. And any words that come from their fingers touching the keyboards are brilliant and genius. And everyone will stop what they're doing, put everything down, and read every word with complete fascination. You realize I'm being sarcastic, I'm hoping. And so on. Now, why does this matter if we have control or not control over that stuff? Because, of course, we don't have enough to do, we TechComm professionals. And because the world is changing, I am hearing we are increasingly being asked to be responsible for some of this ad hoc content. So if we have control over it, we can be responsible for it in some ways. We can clean it up. We can make it more coherent. We can have it follow good writing guidelines. We can make it follow good information design. We can do a lot of that. We can incorporate it many times back into our product documentation, which really rocks because our users know an awful lot too. But if we don't have control, it can be very upsetting because we can be looking at stuff that is full of grammatical errors, that is barely coherent, but darn it, it's accurate. It's accurate. If the customer does that, it's accurate. If they can figure out what this is supposed to be saying. Worse is when you look at it and you realize this is completely inaccurate, and it's on somebody's, blog, and they've locked down comments, so you can't even comment on it. You can't even point out to people that this ad hoc content is just flat wrong. It's not going to work, and it's never going to work. No matter how much you want to do that, it's never going to work. So one of the things that I'm discovering, because I think in the TechComm field, we're very helpful people by nature. We want to help people. That's part of why we're in this field. If we don't have any control over that content and it's wrong or inaccurate or whatever it is, it upsets us. It makes us frustrated. And it sounds silly for me to say this, but if you don't have control and it's upsetting you, stop looking at it. I know. But it's out there, and it's wrong, and it's my product, and I know it's wrong, right? I know. As long as it's not, most of it isn't wrong. Most of it is just messy and ugly, and as long as that ad hoc content is messy and ugly, as long as your customers will put up with it. That's the best you can do with it. But remember that our content, the content that we're creating as the TechComm professionals, our content is the official voice. And that actually gives us a lot. If we've got the official voice, we've got an inherent authority. We have got an inherent expertness. And our content is going to be taken more seriously as the source of all things that are real. Okay? So I wanted to point out that this is happening and that this may or may not be something that we need to plan for. This ad hoc content that needs to get pulled into our own content. All right, so talked a little bit about what content is. Now let's look at what is success. To have a successful project, we want to have a successful project, we need to define what we mean. We need to think about what do we mean by successful. And it seems obvious to those of us in TechComm, and I have made this mistake. I made this mistake the last time I was doc manager. I just assumed that everybody understood what a successful documentation project was because they had been doing software for so long. They understood what a successful software project was, so I assumed that it was the same. And it was not, as it turns out. And part of defining what we mean by a successful project is also then setting those expectations. So when we say that we want to have a successful documentation project, do we mean one that is delivered on time or within budget or the content that we said we would deliver? Do we mean that the content will be accurate, or it will reduce customer support costs, or it will be of high quality, whatever high quality is, and we should define that, or something else? Now, we can decide that we want some of these to be what we mean when we say a successful project. We can decide we want all of these, or none of these, or others. I mean, it's up to us to make that decision. We get to define what we mean by successful project. However, your management probably has a definition of what they mean when they say a successful project. They may even, depending on how well your management knows documentation, your management may even have a definition for a successful documentation project. And if they do, you need to find out what that is. Even if they don't know anything about docs, they do know what a successful project is for a software or a hardware thing. They know what that is. So find out what that definition is, and then use that for docs. Now, if they don't know what successful docs project is, and you're taking a successful software project definition, for example, you're going to need to extend that a little bit to add a little bit more definition for a docs project, because while we are kind of like the rest of the product, we're also kind of different, a little bit. And then understand that whatever definition that you come up with for success, that's going to change over time, simply because you'll be getting better at being successful, and you'll realize that we can knock this out of the park now every time. We've got our processes down. We know what we're doing so well that this is easy. Well, let's add to that now. Let's extend that. Let's go for even better. Personal story for just a moment. I have started working out again after more than a few years off from working out, and I'm amused at myself being an overachiever. I am trying to, I realized this week, set a new personal best in something I'm doing every day, which is silly. Every day is silly. That's a little bit overachieving. So I'm trying to just a personal best once a week. Once a week I need to do something a little bit better. And the reason this relates is I'm getting good at doing stuff. So as I get good at it, some things become easy. Good, then let's improve those. Let's get better at some things now. It's not only going to change over time because you're going to get better, it's going to change over time because things are changing. Things are changing rapidly in our field. And so what worked as a metric for success last year may not make it this year. This year you may have to change that because there's new stuff. It also may change per deliverable. Social media content may have a completely different metric than internally created content. So what you're doing with ad hoc content and defining you've had a successful ad hoc content project may be a completely different measurement than internally created content. Completely different. The content, the measurement, the metric for a successful English content project may be completely different than your metrics for a successful localized content project, simply because what needs to be done is different. And so it may simply be different. Now, once you've defined what you mean by successful, evangelize it. And this is another mistake I made last time I was docs manager. Not only did they not know what successful meant, I did not properly evangelize it. So you're learning from my mistakes. Now that you know what you mean by definition for success, evangelize it internally. What you're trying to do is make sure that everybody else also knows when you say, we've had a successful project, they know what that means. They don't just nod and go, oh, I guess it was all spelled right. Which is nice. It's nice when it's all spelled right. But we have all seen absolute garbage projects that were all spelled right. The information was inaccurate. It was incoherent. It was essentially of no value to any other human being. But by golly gosh, it was all spelled right, wasn't it? So not necessarily so good there. So you want people to get a better understanding of what is meant by success. Now, not everyone is necessarily going to get on board. And there's a number of good reasons for that. Not everybody is going to buy into that's what successful means. For example, I worked with a localization manager once whose his metric for a successful docs project was we hit the deadline and it had no typos. I'm not joking. We hit the deadline and it had no typos. That was his metric for a successful project, a successful docs project. And frighteningly, before I took the documentation department from him, he ran the docs department. And the content that the department created met his metric and was by and large of no real value to the users. But by God, it met his metric for success. So not everybody's going to get on board because other people may have other ideas, but you can point to what you have defined successful to be and say, and we did that. You can, when people fuss and say, well, I don't think that's, you can say, you know, I understand that you want X, but we have decided that Y is how we are going to measure successful. That's how we've defined it for this year, this time period, whatever it is. And by the way, in most companies that I have worked with, and I have worked with a lot of companies over the years, most organizations do not understand how product documentation happens. As far as they can tell, at the end of the day, we fiddle around in our office all day. God knows what we do, but we fiddle around in the office all day. And then before we go home, we put a ream of paper and a plate of cookies on the floor. And then elves come in the dark of night, and they create product documentation. That's pretty much how docs happen. That's how it all works. And then they weave the paper into gold. We somehow do something with that so that it all gets, you know, it becomes ones and zeros on the computer, and that's how product docs happen. So part of what you'll be doing when you're setting a definition for success is you're going to be exposing a bit how documentation gets created, what's involved in good documentation for your company. And this can be a bit of a change. Probably companies don't necessarily know how this all happens, but you're starting to expose some of that. So Paula, yes, I'm sure that there's a typo on my slide, and that one was for free. In a mystery, should be is a mystery. Okay, Paula, that one's free. Hopefully there are no more, but I'm certain you're going to point it out. All right, ways to evangelize. There are, obviously you could stand up in front of the, you know, every time a group of 5 or more people get together in your company, you could stand up and you could, you know, be irritating. But there are other ways that are I think, better, certainly less irritating. You can include in your status reports to your boss, you know, how close are you to your successful? What does successful mean? How close are you to successful? Project reports. I have been in companies that did status reports to, like, your boss and then a project report to the project managers. I separate those out simply because they have different audiences, and your company may call them different things, you know, but you get the sense of it. The status report is what you give your boss. Project report goes to project managers. Then there's staff meetings. Both your own staff, if you're a docs manager, your staff meeting, make sure that your staff is on board with what successful means. But there's also things like when you have a senior, you know, does your boss have a senior staff meeting where everybody at your level sits down and talks? If so, making sure that everybody there understands that you've gone through this process. You could think of it as part of, you know, the quality process, something like that. Maybe challenge them to come up with what successful looks like for them. So that's often a good way to do it. Depending on your corporate culture, it may be something to put in the corporate newsletter. It may not. It depends on your corporate culture. I have seen companies go both ways. I have seen corporate cultures where it is perfectly appropriate. I've seen corporate cultures where the very last thing you want to do is do that. Project planning documents, that's often a good place to put what you mean by success, you know, how we are going to have a successful project and it is going to be blah. So in your project planning documents. Chatting in the lunchroom. Never, ever, ever underestimate chatting in the lunchroom. It's always good to just chit-chat, not like the only thing you've ever had to say, but just chit-chat. Another way to evangelize is to solicit opinions from other people, ignoring the ones that you don't like or the ones that are stupid, because people don't always know about docs, and so you just want to ignore the ideas that are stupid. But, smile and go, that is something to think about. We really hadn't given that any thought. You're right, we should go back to typewriters because that's just better. That's certainly a thought that we've not really thought about that, but we're going to certainly put that down on the list of things to think through the next time we do that evaluation. And I really want to thank you for giving us that. That's really, if you have any other insight, you should certainly share that with us. And the whole time you're thinking, are you from another planet? What do you mean go back to a typewriter? But, you don't want to shut people down, because just because they've had 3 stupid ideas doesn't mean their next idea is going to be stupid. Their next idea could be fantastic. And you don't want to shut people down. You want them to feel like they can contribute, because you do. At least I do. I like doing that. So there's that. All right, so we have defined a couple of things. We've covered what content is now, and that's really changed. We've talked about what a successful project might be. We've looked at what defining success, what that might be. Let's look at some planning. And this is where I think a lot of us are getting nervous because the world is changing so quickly. I have some good news for you. The planning that you know how to do is, to a great extent, going to still be helpful. The world has not changed that much. It is changing, absolutely, but it is not changing so much that what we know how to do is of no value in this area. We just need to make some changes. So some of this is going to be familiar to you. You want to create a quality metric of some sort. That's going to help, because without a quality metric, you really can't figure out what it is you're going to be planning, because otherwise you could just, write a bunch of stuff and then say we're done. So I like to, before I plan the first thing, I like to set up a quality metric. It kind of goes with the success, kind of not. So I pulled it out separate. So, for example, and these are only suggestions, you should set up what works for you. I'm just saying, in the absence of anything else, you could set up a level 1 quality, which is there's no index, there's no examples, but by God, it's spell checked. That's a metric. That is a quality metric. And that is, for some projects, I am sorry to say, that is a perfectly valid metric to shoot for and ship it. We've spell checked it, and it's being shipped. It is not where you'd like to live, but I'm hoping all of us, because if we have not all been on a project like this, I get to look like I'm an idiot, because the rest of you are looking at me going, she actually has that as a metric and has actually had projects like that. I really have. Level 2, which is not bad. You have verified the docs against the software. You have maybe done some indexing. You have obviously done some spell checking. And you've used Paula to do a little bit of copy editing. And that's pretty exciting. And it would be good if all of our projects, we get to at least that level of quality. You're welcome, Paula. Obviously, level 3 is the very best. It's been optimized for readability, comprehensibility. It's been optimized for localization. It meets all of the previous metrics. It's maybe meeting professional, instructional design stuff. I mean, it's really good. It's really good. So once we figured out what we're going to accept as acceptable for delivering, now we can start planning. The hours per page metric still works, even though we're not thinking much about pages anymore. But because thinking topics isn't helpful to us, we're not shipping much in the way of pages, but we're having to think about our content in some measurable way, so we're still talking about pages. So with any luck at all, you have for you, whether it's you for you personally or you as your group or you as a company, you have an hour per page metric of some sort. If you don't, or you kind of vaguely do and you're wondering, don't forget that it also takes time to manage your project, to research and interview, to write and edit, to do any illustrations that are needed, to proofread. For example, like I did not. You should have seen the ones I caught following up. I'm a little tense about this. To do the proofing. You need to build in time for your project for any translation. You need to build in time for preparing to publish or to publish to multiple targets. I'm going to come back to this publish to multiple targets thing. This is something that we are forgetting, and we need to make sure we're including time for this. Attending project meetings, attending review sessions, etc. So I'm going to show you some numbers. If you don't have any numbers, I'm going to show you numbers. But I don't want you to flip out. This is the reason I showed you the previous slide before I showed you this slide, is because if I don't tell you, don't forget all this other stuff, people flip out and go, duh, what are you insane? I can write, I can do a topic an hour. Well, yeah, except that then you also have to create your graphics, your index you have to do. There's all this other stuff that is part of creating that page. So if you are right, all things being equal, these are fairly industry standard. Your numbers are going to vary. For example, if I am working on a project for a client and I know their stuff really well for their user guide, I'm going to go way faster than 5 hours per page. To go from zero, from nothing to ready to ship, I'm probably going to be going at 2 hours, 2.5 hours per page. Because I know this domain really well. I know their product well. I know what their product does. I know what their customers need. I know this really well. But if I am working with one of my interns, they don't know the tool terribly well. They don't know the product terribly well. They're still fairly uncertain about all of this. We're going to hit every bit of 5 hours per page. We may go as high as 8 hours per page. So that's why I'm saying your numbers are going to vary, but if you don't have numbers, these are not a bad place to start. Training guides, and by training guide, we can expand that out to be a lot more than just what we've historically thought of as training guides. But the typical metric is about 30 hours of work for 1 hour of training. Now, if we've got some trainers who can tell me that, no, those numbers have changed now, the industry numbers have changed, that's fantastic, I will take them. The last numbers I heard were about that. Context-sensitive help, and I'm saying if you're just creating context-sensitive help, there's no user guide, there's no single sourcey kind of thing that you're doing. You are creating a context-sensitive help that is separate from any user guide. Figure about 3 hours a topic, because you're going to have to create, figure out what things need to be context-sensitive, and then create that. Create that content and then hook that up and then test it, all of that. Content that you're going to multi-publish. By multi-publish, I mean you're going to publish it to online help. You're going to publish it to a PDF. You may be publishing it to a print doc. You may be publishing it to your web as well. Probably about 4 hours a topic. And that number, that's if you know your tool well. If you don't know your tool well, it may take more than that. Simply because there's a lot to think about when we're publishing to multi-targets. Because at that point now we're looking at our content really differently than if we're working in FrameMaker to do a quick start guide. And then I talked about that ad hoc content. If you are looking at cleaning up community-generated content, and I'm not necessarily calling this ad hoc content because this is the stuff that you got control over, I'm finding, number one, there is no industry metric for that. I'm finding that it's about an hour per 500 words. So if you've got some ad hoc content that you've got some control over, that you're cleaning it up, maybe it's in your user forms that you've got control over, and it's good content, it's good stuff. It just needs to be cleaned up. The language isn't good. Maybe they didn't realize they should do numbered steps, so it's all kind of in a narrative, paragraphy kind of thing, that kind of stuff. I'm finding it takes about an hour per 500 words. But I want you to understand that number is going to vary wildly. If you have somebody who just nails it in terms of the technology, and English isn't their first language, and they apparently were frightened by definite articles when they were a small child and they've never used them since, then it's obviously going to take a lot longer to clean their stuff up. If they have all the right instincts to be a good technical communicator, but they've just got no formal training, probably going to take less time. And that's just the nature of the beast. So there seems to be no industry figure for this right now. I wanted to give you a, in my experience, kind of number, but do not take that number and assume that that number is gold and will work in all circumstances for all source content. It's just a place to start. That's all. All right, some common estimating errors I always like to point out because nobody ever makes these errors, right? The first non-zero probability, which I love. I'm going to get that printed on a T-shirt one day. And it's just going to say first non-zero probability, which is to plan towards the very first possible date the project could be completed. And I am pretty sure that if I could see you all, that when I ask this question, everyone's going to raise their hand, which is how many of us have ever had a project ship on the first date that they said the project was going to ship? I don't know that I've ever seen a project ship on the first date that they said it was going to ship. But we all have to act as if, don't we? Which is, kind of crazy because we all know it's not going to ship on that date, but we all have to act as though it's going to ship on that date until they say, oh, well, no, it's not actually going to ship on that date. And then we all go, phew, I knew it wasn't, but I was so scared this was going to be the one time, right? The one time, because I really need, the extra 2 months for whatever it is they're adding in. So we tend to plan towards that date and then plan the least. Or we tend to ignore that date, assume they're not going to hit that date, and we plan for 3 months after that. And then, oh, dear God, they're actually looking as though they're going to ship on that date. So there's something in between, which is a better way to do it, which is to assume that they're probably not going to hit that date, but have a plan for hitting that date that is a doable plan, that does not involve killing people to get that plan complete. Remember successful? One of my definitions of a successful project is no writer was killed in the implementation of this project, unless the client is paying to kill writers. In that case, my definition of a successful project may include, and we killed 3 writers to make that deadline. Being a consultant, very often we are in fact hired to be killed on the project. That is part of why we've been hired. And that's fine. I take those projects when I feel like it would be worthwhile or fun or interesting. Paul is worried that they're going to kill editors because the truth is if there's an editor, they're the tail of the dog, and they often are the ones who get killed because they sit there doing nothing, doing nothing, doing nothing. Oh, dear God, I have to edit 400 pages of content over the weekend because you do. Then another common estimating error is the guess factor, which is, frankly, I see this a lot in new docs managers or people who are new to kind of running stuff, which is they figure, well, I think we can do this much with what I think of as a fudge factor. And what they're doing is actually making this all up. They have no idea. They have no idea. They're guessing. I don't know. I think we can do this. Even if you are a sole writer, you should be in some way tracking how much time stuff takes you, because you should be. It is important to know. Very few of us are good at estimating projects right away, and we have to track our time to figure it out. We just do. And then, and I also like this one too, devoutly desired results. And that should go in a T-shirt all by itself too, which is everybody sitting there looking at you, saying, so we can make the deadline, right? And you're sitting there and your gut is telling you, no, we can't. We can't make that deadline. And you're thinking, not with the staff I've got, not with the workload we've got, but everybody's sitting there staring at you. The entire team is staring at you. And they've all committed to making that deadline. And you're looking at them and they're looking at you, and so you just go, yeah, sure. Yeah, we can do it. We can do it. We can do it. We can make that deadline. Yeah, yeah, we can take that hill. Yeah. But in the back of your mind, you know, rational voice is going, there's no way. Not with the staff we've got, not with the budget we've got, and not with the time available. One of those things has to move. And that's going to come and bite you. Nothing good is going to happen from any of these errors. You're not going to like it. Some things for you to think about if you are fairly new at planning. Think about external factors like, do you know for a fact that your most senior writer is going out on maternity leave in 3 weeks? She's going to be gone for 4 months. The project ships in 3 months. Do you see a problem there? Yeah. Is the product stable? Has it ever been stable? Will it ever be stable? And so on. Is your team brand new? Maybe you guys bought a new product, and nobody on your team has ever worked with a product like that before. That's big. That's a really big one. SME availability. I've got a client right now who is very slow to get their SMEs available. And that's impacting their project. And there's nothing I can do about that. I can't force them to get their SMEs to be available. I can't. They are aware it's impacting their project, but I can't force them to do anything. So on. So think about these things. All of these things and more, these are not the only things, but all of these things are going to impact the complexity of a project. The more complex the project, the more time / staff / etc. you're going to need to deliver, all things being equal. You can cut back on what it is you're going to deliver, etc. Let's go back. No, Paula, that's fine. The first and third, please explain the difference between the first and third definition. You mean external factors and information availability? 2 slides back now. Okay, enough. Actually, you know what? Let me see if I can come back to this, Paula. Don't let me forget, but I'm looking at the clock. I want to go forward, and then I'll come back to that. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right, so the product development environment that you're working in also is a big thing to think about when you're planning. And there are many ways to do product development, and I'm talking about just 2, well, technically a third, but the 2 big ones. Pretty much everything else is kind of variants of these 2. So Waterfall. Waterfall is iterative. A waterfall environment, there is a lot of planning that goes in up front, and I mean a lot. You know, there is the development planning, there's the docs planning, there's the QA planning, there's the testing, there's lots of it. And it's called a waterfall because there are phases of projects, and you typically finish one phase before the next phase starts. If you've ever been in aerospace, aerospace does only waterfall planning. That product. Aerospace only does waterfall kinds of projects. It is a very conservative way to do projects because each phase is very clear. Each phase gets done. There's very little overlap. It's a very stable way of doing things, but it also can be a very slow way to do this. Waterfall is also a little more typical in a hardware kind of environment. So if you're building hardware, you're going to get more of a waterfall environment because at some point we need to have a factory tool up to start building this thing. We can't keep changing it if the factory's got a tool up. At some point we've got to say, we've got ourselves a product here and we need to stop doing stuff to it. So a waterfall process works better in a hardware. It is, I said, aerospace, government, any of these big monolithic kind of places are typically using more of a waterfall kind of environment. What is coming up more in the software world, and I've spent most of my career in software. I've done some hardware, but most of my career has been in software, is the Agile environment. The Agile environment, you're going to see a lot of customer stories driving development. And I wish I could see a show of hands, but I'm hoping probably, although you guys are different because you've got a lot of oil and gas down in Dallas, but I'm guessing that you guys are probably all working in more of an Agile environment simply because it's becoming much more popular. Customer stories are stories about how the customer is going to, or what the customer is going to want to do, specifically often with the product. What is the customer going to want to do? And then people go off and they make the product able to do that. There is not a lot of planning. There is some planning, and those plannings are, the planning, to call it planning is to make it sound more structured than it really is. They're called sprints. They are typically customer stories that we've all decided we're going to make those customer stories happen. Off we go, we're going to do that. We're going to have stand-up meetings once a day, sometimes more often than that, but usually once a day, where we all talk about what we did yesterday, and we talk about what we're going to do today, and then we all go do it. You'll see Agile more often in software because, again, if you're doing it in hardware, at some point you've got to have a factory spin up to make the hardware. Agile is very fast, and it is not real stable. It's not a real stable environment. Things change very, very quickly. We cannot have things changing very quickly if we're going to have a factory tool up. And those two things don't work. Now, you can have the mix of both, which I have seen in hardware, where you are working a more agile environment for hardware, and then at some point, the whole thing rolls over into more of a waterfall. It doesn't really become waterfall, but it certainly becomes a hybrid of Agile and waterfall. Because, again, at some point, you've got to have that factory. So there is that. So those two environments plus this mix of both. And this mix can be anything. And some of you are in this environment where they say we're doing Agile, but when you go look up Agile, it's not really Agile. I mean, it's kind of Agile. I mean, there's some words that we're using that come from Agile. It's not really Agile. It kind of seems to be whatever we want it to be today. And then tomorrow it's something different. And you're not alone. I don't know that I have much more for you after you're not alone, but you're not alone. Regardless of the environment that you're working in, though, you can do some planning, and you should be doing some planning. Because write like hell and hope for the best is not a plan. And you're not going to like what happens in the write like hell and hope for the best environment, because you're not. You cannot maintain that kind of workload. You cannot. Now, Agile can be tougher to plan in. Absolutely, it can be tougher to plan in. But grab the customer stories. Listen to what people are saying in the stand-up meeting every day that they're working on. For the tech writer, it is a much tougher environment because we have to chase down people and ask them, what are you working on? Show me how that's working. Show me how that's... We spend a lot of time redoing things, but that's the nature of Agile. For a lot of people, that's the fun part because it is so dynamic. It is changing. But it can be frustrating because this is the third time this week that part of the product has changed, and I'm having to rewrite that part of the docs again. Ugh. But there are ways to manage. I have a client who says they are Agile. They're not really. They're one of those. But they say they are. And so we have an expectation, going way back to that expectation for success. We set the expectation a long time ago with this client, because I've been with them for about 2 years. Set the expectation a long time ago that a successful docs project runs one Agile release behind. Now, this company does not release the docs at the end of an Agile sprint. Some companies do. This one does not. But their expectation is that docs will always be one Agile sprint behind. They roll up a bunch of sprints and then release every 6 months or so. So we are typically up to date when they do the full release. We are typically up to date. So what they release is, in fact, what is in the docs. but we have that expectation when they are reviewing the docs that we will be at least one Agile release behind. So we look like champions when we release and we're up to date. There have been a couple of times where things were changing so quickly at the end we could not release completely up to date. And we still had a successful release because we had set that expectation. That's why I started there. I just had to get water in my mouth. It's getting dry. I've been talking since 7 a.m., which is 10 hours ago, except for the part where I worked at. I wasn't talking to Jim, but there it is. So that's why I wanted to start with. Let's define what successful means, because you're going to need that way down here, regardless of the environment you're in. You want to set that expectation, and you've probably got control over that expectation. All right, so I don't know. At this point, I just decided that I liked songs. I don't know. So deliverables, they are changing, and it's a whole new world. Hopefully, at least one of you has got. Those are actually plays on 2 songs. I don't know if you've noticed, but the deliverables that we are delivering now are changing. There's the old standbys. There's hard copies. There's PDFs. There's online help in that we want our customers connected to the internet to get the help. There's offline help in which we don't expect them to be connected to the internet. It's all installed locally on their machine. There's ebooks, and the definition of an ebook, gigantic, huge, different. We're delivering for smartphones now or other smart devices. My gas guy, the gas meter guy came by today, and he's got a machine. And he just stands there, and he does stuff on the machine. Well, that machine also has instructions. It has, in essence, online help. But it's a smart device. It's connected to the internet. There's tablets. Personally, in our household, we've got 2 Nooks and an iPad, 2 color Nooks and an iPad. We'll probably get another iPad, which will be a different iPad at some point. And I'm thinking about, getting a new color Nook because, I can. There's HTML5 and all the changes that that's going to be bringing. Then there's multiple languages. You may or may not be localizing, translating, but you probably will at some point. There's device sniffing content, which I think is cool. That's my phrase. That's content that actually is aware of what device it's being used on and adapts itself to be appropriately displayed on that device. There's a couple of vendors who can do that now. There's just a whole much more. This is like the Wild West right now. This is one of the most exciting times I've ever thought of in our industry. And I thought I'd seen some pretty darn exciting times. So there's all of these different deliverables. And back when I was talking about planning, I talked about you need to think about this stuff because it is very reasonable to expect somebody to wander into your office and say, hey, you know how we're doing user guides for that thing that we're delivering, in 6 weeks? Yeah, our customers say that they want to be able to read that content on their tablet out in the field too. That won't be a problem, right? And you're sitting there thinking, no, heck no, PDFs in the ebooks? How hard can that be? I mean, I don't know anything about it, but, well, depending on the tool you're using, it could be very difficult or not. But now you've got to take the time to find that out. So the way we were, I know, I was in a song mood, what can I tell you? The way we have been isn't working anymore. We don't even call it single sourcing anymore. If you've been in the field for any length of time, for like 10 years or so, you remember we used to call it single sourcing. That was the big revolution, the single source. That meant that we wrote in, Word or FrameMaker, and then we shoved it out into online help. That was single sourcing, right? That was like, whoo, craziness. We've got 2 things that we're going to be shipping. Wow, this is crazy. We don't even call it single sourcing anymore. We call it it's called multi-channel publishing now because we've gone beyond even one thing. We're publishing out to all of those different targets, and we know there's more coming. We don't even know if they are, but we know they're coming. So creating content in the book metaphor is getting more and more expensive. By book metaphor, I mean using products that are locking our content into long things like chapters. So if, for example, you're working in Word, you have, number one, you have my deepest sympathies, and I'm really, really sorry that you're working in Word. But it's no longer working to work in Word because Word was never built to do what it is that we do, and as our world is changing even more, it's simply not working. So the metaphors, the paradigms behind how we're developing content are also changing, and the tools that you're using may not be working anymore. And I'm not saying that you need to run out and get new tools. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying it may be something that you need to be thinking about, be looking at, because the success of your project may be depending on you moving to a new tool, coming up with a different way of creating your content. If somebody walks in your office and says they need ebooks and you're doing Word, you're in trouble. Especially if they say, no, seriously, we need ebooks, because you can't really get there from Word. I mean, you can, but it's not fun and you won't like it very much. It's doable. I can tell you how to do it. It's doable, but man, not that fun. All right, so that is right at the hour. I'm amazed. I'm just amazed. Now, Paula had a question. So let's go back to Paula's question. Let me go back. Back there. Paula wanted to know the difference between first non-zero probability and the devoutly desired results. I can see situations in which they're different. I can also see situations in which they both look on the surface to be the same. And I think it depends more on kind of the environment in which they're done. If everybody is staring at you and you tend to go along, get along, go along kind of person, you're going to probably be doing a lot of devoutly desired results planning because you want to get along, If you are not clever about how you're doing stuff, the first non-zero probability is probably, the results are going to look the same as the motivations behind them. Does that answer your question, Paula? Did I get that answer? I'm hoping. Hoping. Oh, Paula's napping now. The results, what? The planning results, the dates that you come up with, the what's possible, all of that, are going to the results, the date, and what you say you're going to deliver. Those may look the same, but the motivation of how you got there are going to be different. Okay, good, excellent. Paula got it. Okay. Now, don't go away, guys, but since we're recording this, and because there's a bonus to actually attending this live, I want to do something to stop the recording. So for those of you who are watching this recording, I want to thank you. It's been a ton of fun. There's my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me.